Hey guys, welcome to another episode of LFA's Shop Shop. On this episode, I buy 2 new cars and start working on the Commodores. So as you would have just seen, we've got a new intro. So this is just temporary, but it's better than nothing. So these 2 cars that I'm about to buy, you'll see in a later episode. This is just me picking them up. I thought I'd keep you up to date. So we're on our way to buy another car and make some more bad decisions. So Emily is in the driver's seat and we'll be there in a couple of minutes. So I'll show you when we get there. So we just finished looking at the mystery car and it is a Daihatsu Sior. I didn't film anything at the guy's house just to be a bit more respectful. So it's going to get delivered in about 2 hours and I'll take some videos then. So the second Sior has arrived and it's pretty rough, but it's good enough for what I need it for. So I bought this from a friend of mine. She was just sick of it and wanted to get rid of it. So I bought it for $450 plus $100 for the tow truck. It runs a bit rough, but it does run. It's not super happy about it, but it's got all the parts I need for the other shell. So I'll swap all this interior over except for the auto stuff. So the second Sior is here. It runs, it's automatic, but apparently it smokes a little bit. So Jackson's just going to rev it up for me. She's a bit smoky, boys. So here they are, the 2 Siors. So we've got a blue one, which is running, driving, automatic. Pretty filthy. And it's a bit rough. And then we've got a white one, which is just a shell, but it was a manual, so there's pedals and stuff in this one. So it's got a whole bunch of weird stuff on the inside, just parts and exhaust and stuff, and air tanks, because this one has been airbagged at some point in the back. So it's been tubbed, and all the airbag stuff's under the back still, all there, and then it's got the tubs. So in the back this thing sits on the fuel tank, and in the front it just had chop springs, so it looks like someone's put stock springs back in it. So the plan is to reshell this blue one into the white one and then repaint it and make a new car with the parts from Emily's car, the blue Sior and the white one, and just make the best of the 3 spares, and then whatever else is better, so the better stuff will go into Em's car, which is in the shed still, and then the leftovers will go into the white one. And then we'll end up with 2 good cars out of 3. So that is the plan. I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but I need to do the Commodores first. So I want to get rid of this thing kind of soon, because I'm sick of having so many cars in the yard. So to do that, we need some parts off of this for this one. So I'm going to start by pulling the seats out of this and pressure wash them. Alright, so it's supposed to be super hot tomorrow. So I've got the back seats out of the VS. I'll give these a pressure wash. They're actually in really good condition, but I'll just give them a clean anyway. And then tomorrow they'll be able to dry out, and then I'll move on to the front seats once I've got these done. So the seats are out and I've given them a wash. So the fronts came up pretty good. This one, which is the driver's side, has a small little hole in it, but way better than what I've got in the other car. And the back came up pretty good as well. So someone had seat covers on these for many years, so they definitely saved the seats. There's still a few marks here and there, but I'm pretty happy with them overall. So now time to take the seats out of the VN. So I actually like the design of these seats better, but they're ripped and filthy. So they're going to come out, and the new VS ones, which I just washed, will go back in. There we go, the VN seats are out. So this one has a 1-piece back seat, or top and bottom 1 piece, rather than the other car, which had a 2-piece back seat. Which brings me to my next point. Thanks Ashley, I got a boot full of sticks, so now I have to get all these out to then pull the interior out and swap it into the VN. So got all the sticks out and got the VS carpet out, which is much better condition than the VN one, even though it's got sticks all over it. So I have to wash this off now, try and get it cleaned up and ready to go in. So it's super hot today, so I quickly just vacuumed out the VN. So this is the car we're keeping. So I just need to put the seats in we pressure washed yesterday. So here we have the VS front seats bolted in. and a few other bits from later in the episode. But they're so much better, much more comfortable, and much cleaner. Alright, so I'm about halfway through swapping the back seat in the VN to the VS seat. And the VS has the 60-40 split back seat. So you can see here, I've swapped the flap that covers the back of the seat when they're down, sort those over. So then I had to swap this mount over, which is the seat mount for the center, or the 60-40 split. So that wants to sit right there, which is fine, but the floor doesn't have the mounting for it. So what I'm going to do is grind this sound deadening back. So I've marked out where I want this sound deadening removed. So I'm just going to use the flap wheel on the grinder and hopefully just persuade it out the way. So hopefully that'll give us some fresh metal to attach that to. Alright, so I modified what I needed to modify, and these seats are now in. So we've got the 60-40 split. So if you push on them pretty hard up the front, this back plate clips in, and then to release it, you've got to put a bit of pressure on it, lift this up, and then the seat will come up. Easy. This did my head in, and I think I cracked my tooth with the electric ratchet because it smacked me in the face. So I'm calling it for the day. That's all I'm doing. So the back, I need the trims for the windows and the trim for the tailgate, and it will start looking like a car again, and then the interior will be done. Then I just need to vacuum everything again because I keep tracking grass into the car. And then it's on to mechanicals, which is the springs and the diff and the tyres. $12.35 in coins just from the VN and the VS. This is why you always check under the seats and keep all the coins, because eventually it adds up. Alright, so the time has come to do some mechanical work on the Commodores. So I'm going to rip the wheels off the front of these two. They're already on jack stands. And then take the springs out of the VS, take the springs out of the VN. Hopefully the VS springs fit in the VN and lift it up again. So this is the front of the VN. You can see it's got king springs in it, so they're yellow, and it's a stub axle type. And the VS is a strut and knuckle type, so I'll show the difference later. Alright, so I don't suggest doing this how I've done it. So I unbolted the 3 bolts from the top, and then used a pair of multi-grips to grab this, and then undid the nut at the top with the rattle gun. Not the best way to do it, probably take the whole strut out, but these shocks are knackered, so I'm not too concerned. I'll replace those in the future if I decide to keep the car, and they'll be fine for now. So if I were to do this again, I would leave it bolted in. Get a 22mm deep socket with a hex head on it, so you can put a spanner on it, and then put a screwdriver in the end of the shock to hold the shock from spinning, and then use the spanner on the deep socket to undo it, and then it will come undone. And also put spring compressors on it to compress it all down, but I wasn't too concerned with this because they are low springs and they're quite soft as well, so there's not a lot in those, so that's fine. Here is the part number if you're interested. So I'm going to have to bolt all this back together, but I'm going to use the VS springs, so let's get them out of that car first. So spinning around to the VS, you can immediately tell this side is going to be different, because instead of having the 3 bolts on the top, it's got a bunch. So let's take this wheel off and I'll show you the difference down there. So this is the VS, you can see it's quite filthy. Now this is the difference. This strut has 2 bolts on the knuckle. So the hub bolts to the knuckle bolts to the suspension. So the VN is like a Corolla, where the strut tube and the stub axle are one piece, and then the hub bolts to that. And then the lower control arm bolts to the bottom of the stub axle. Whereas with this type, the lower control arm bolts to the bottom of the knuckle, then the hub bolts to the knuckle, and the suspension bolts to the knuckle by those 2 bolts at the back here, which you can see there on the side here. So this side, I'm going to undo all the bolts at the top, undo those 2 at the bottom, and the whole strut should come out, and then I can use the spring compressors and it'll be a whole lot easier. So I've got the strut out of the VS, so it's these 2 bolts here, 22mm on this side, 19mm on this side. You have to take out the top caliper bolt, which is a 19mm as well, to get the bottom bolt out. So undo that, that's easy enough. Then you have to undo the sway bar end link, which is a 14mm on the bottom, 14mm on the top, and then hold it with some vice grips in the middle. Or if you don't care so much, just cut it in half. So this car is just going to be a paddock basher, so I don't need to put a sway bar back in it, that's fine. So up the top is all the 1/2 inch nuts, so undo all of those. And before you do that, just push this brake line with the rubber grommet out of the strut. So that'll leave you with a strut like this. So what we need to do is get the spring compressors, which I borrowed from a mate of mine, because mine are buried in the shed at Mum's house. Put them on there, undo the nut on the top. So I'll probably have to hold this strock again with the vice grip. So clamp that, undo that, slide the whole spring off, put the lowered one on, put it back on. Or in this case, put the stock spring back on the VN. So I've got the spring compressors onto the spring. So do them up until the spring is loose in the shock. That way there's no preload on this top hat. Get your socket and chuck it on the end of the strut here. Then hold the shock with a pair of multi-grips. If you're not keeping the shocks, then that's fine. If you are, then you need to try and get a spanner on the end of here, or a screwdriver like on the other one, and then use a spanner on this one to then crack those two separately. So either way you're doing it, if you're keeping it, do it that way. If you're not keeping it, just chuck a pair of multi-grips on there and you'll be fine, which is what I'm doing. So this strut actually was a little bit different to all the other ones I've done. So there was the first nut that I showed you in the last clip, then a top cap and the strut top. Then there was a second nut, and then some washers and some spacers and a bearing, a bump stop, and then a dust cover and the spring isolator. So I've got the spring out. Now I'll do the spring compressors up a bit tighter and then put it all back into the VN. Alright, so I'm not sure where I finished off yesterday, but I got the VS back together and it's now got the lowered springs in it. So this is ready for bush bashing in the front anyway. I'm going to take a bunch of panels off anyway, but so that's all back together. That was actually really easy. The VN has been a nightmare. So last night Dale came around and dropped me off a ball joint fork, which is laying around here somewhere. That thing. So with that, I've managed to get this side back together with the higher springs from the VS. So now I'll show you how I did it. So just pretend for a minute that this car is all together properly. So leave the strut top bolted together, bolted to the car, and then undo that nut in there on the top of the stub axle. Then get your ball joint fork and put it in here between the bottom of the stub axle and the ball joint in there, and then hit it as hard as you can repeatedly until it pops open. So if these have been together for a long time, they're going to be slightly rusted together and it's going to be a pain in the ass, but it does happen. So just keep hitting it pretty much. Then the strut will be free. So then you need to undo, I undid both ends of the sway bar end link, so the top, the bottom down there and the top up here. So undo both of those and take your brake caliper off as well. So I'm going to start with that, take the brake caliper off, get it out of my way, undo the sway bar end link, and then undo that nut on the top there, put the ball joint in and smack it. So I'll show you that process. So two 19mm bolts on the caliper, cut that cable tie, spray that with WD-40, spray that with WD-40, vice grips on here and a 14mm on either end. So undo both of those and get the nuts off. Then undo this 22mm nut, then get the ball joint fork into here like that, and then hit that as hard as you can until the thread starts to go down. So once you get it to crack, it'll be nice and loose like so. Then you want to get some kind of leverage and push the lower control arm down so that that thread comes the whole way out the bottom of the stub axle, and this can be a bit of a pain. So there we go, the stub axle is off of the ball joint, and that sway bar end link that we undid is now loose as well. So put that aside. So now this stub axle and all of the strut is only held in by the tie rod end, which I'm not too concerned about. So I'll just undo the 3 bolts at the top here and then the whole thing will come out. So I'm happy to do that. If you're not, you'll have to undo this split pin, undo that nut, and then use the ball joint breaker again, pop the tie rod end out, and then this whole thing will come loose. I'm just going to do that in the car so I have one less thing to undo. So I've got the whole strut and stub axle out. So the next stage would be to compress your spring and then take off the top hat. I've already done that, of course. So what I'm going to do now is compress the spring and put it back on, start putting everything back together. So this is the bit where you have to be careful. got the spring compressors on, so make them as long as you can and grab as much of the spring as you can. Just make sure you don't grab the end because that has to sit into the like the spring perch, so this bit here, and then the same on the other end. So I always go one in if I can on both ends, make them as long as you can, and then slowly go side to side and compress them down. So just make sure that you've got them completely opposite each other on the spring, and make sure you go side to side a little bit at a time, otherwise it'll bend to one side and then it can have the chance of springing out and taking your head off. So compress the spring as much as you can. See, I've got about an inch gap here and a little bit less than over there, so this is probably about right for what I'm doing. So the more you compress it, the easier the next job will be. So that is to fit it onto here and get the top hat on. If it's too long, you just won't be able to get the top hat on. If it's too short, then there's no issue. You just put the top hat on, do the nut up, and then undo the spring compressor and you're all good to go. So all you need to do is put your bump stop on and then put this rubber boot cover on. Put a zip tie around here if that's what you're doing. If you've got the right tools, then you can do that now. If you don't have the right tools like I don't, then you'll have to do that later. So then got the top spring perch into the top of the spring, so make sure you take note of which is the top and the bottom. It's easy for me because the bottom is filthy and the top is nice and clean. So then you want to put that spring and the top hat over the top of this. Make sure you line up this hole here with the shock and make sure it pokes through. So that's that. Now the last thing you have to remember is to line up the bottom of the spring. So obviously there's an end of the spring where the metal stops. You want to line that up with the pocket in the bottom spring perch. So there's normally a step like this, so you want that to go into that step. And the same with the top, there's a rubber bush that has a step in it as well, so do that on the top. Then you can put the strut top on. So the strut top just slides on like this, then you have a bit of the shock hanging out the top here. So if there's not enough thread here to start the nut, then you'll have to compress the spring some more, or in this case, because the shocks are blown, pull the shock out further. So I'll do that now, put the nut on it, and show you what the next step is. So as you can see, I've got the nut started on the top of the shock. I've got the strut top on, I've got the spring perch, the top spring perch on with the rubber isolator, got the rubber boot, and then this is the part where I need to do up the nut on the top of the shock. So if you've got the right tool to hold the shock, then that's great, do that. If you don't, and you're dodgy like me, vice grips will do the job okay. You can scratch the strut and make it leak and then bugger up the strut, but mine is actually knackered anyway, so it doesn't really matter too much for me. I'm just going to do this for now, get it all stock height again, and then later on if I decide to keep the car, I'll start replacing things. So once that's all done, you can undo the spring compressors, so just make sure you do it side to side slightly, and make sure you line up this bottom section and the top section with the little steps. So once you've got the spring compressors off, if the strut top's still in place, then you're doing alright. So just make sure it spins relatively freely, because if it doesn't, then you'll get binding when you're trying to turn. So now we're going to get the car back together. So I'm going to start by putting this end into the strut top, do up the 3 nuts, and then use leverage and some bars to get the stub axle back over the top of the ball joint and the sway bar end link all in at once. Alright, so get the strut in, put the 3 bolts on the top, the 3 nuts, and that's what it looks like. So I had to use the jack to hold the bottom of the hub and push up and align everything as it went up, and then once you get one thread started in here, put the nut on, and then you can kind of readjust everything and then push it up that last little bit. So that's all done. Now to tackle the ball joint. So this is the super awesome fun part. So the ball joint's out still, got the sway bar end link in the end of here, and need to get that end into the strut. So what I'm going to do is use a pry bar and put it between the cross member and the top of the sway bar. I'll pull down on it, that'll push this down a bit, and hopefully I'll be able to get that top end in, and I can put a nut on either end. So that was actually pretty easy. So I'm just going to put a nut on either end finger tight just so it doesn't come off, and get the ball joint in first so I don't have as much resistance from the rest of the car. Alright, so I managed to pry the lower control arm down and get the ball joint started. So now I'm just going to get the jack and put it under this lower control arm here and push the ball joint back up into place, and then I should be able to get the nut on the top. So I put the jack under the lower control arm and jacked it up until the ball joint was in the correct spot, then chuck the nut on the top and make sure it's nice and tight. So now I just got to finish off the sway bar end link, so put the rubbers back on and then put the brake caliper back on. So I've got the sway bar end links back on, and I've fixed the brake line mount, so I don't need that cable tie anymore. And I've bolted on the caliper. So now I've just got to put a cable tie on this rubber boot to hold it onto the shock, and then put the wheel on. Alright, so it's all back together. Time to put it on the ground. There we go, it's all back on the ground, and now it's super high and looks kind of crappy. VS looks kind of cool, which is going to be trashed anyway. So now just go to the back and swap the diff over as well. So that might be a different episode. But the back, I just need to take the springs out, take the diff out, pull the brakes off, swap the whole diff with the one in the VS. I believe it's lower kilometers and it hasn't got a locker in it. And then put it all back into this one and put all this one back into the other car. And then that one, I'll have to part it out a little bit more. So I'm going to take a few bits off of it and then take it out to Dales and crash it into stuff. And then this one here we get an ID inspection. Thanks for watching this week's episode of El Have a Shop. I hope you enjoyed it, and there'll be plenty more Commodore content next week.